Nile River is not the only river that crosses multiple countries in the world. There are other rivers across the world that go across countries, several countries. But the Nile is the longest river in the world, and it crosses several countries, about 11 countries in across Africa. So there are certain key principles, for example, established key principles either by international legal and guidelines or by tradition. If we start from the international legal guidelines or key principles, for example, the UN has two key principles that guides the conduct of nations regarding shared water courses. The UN calls these cross-country rivers shared water courses. So these key principles are first, equitable and reasonable use, and second, the obligation not to cause significant harm to neighbors. In the case of Nile, the obligation not to cause any other riparian country, not to cause any significant harm to any other riparians of the Nile River. So it is within these key principles that Ethiopia is entitled for an equitable and reasonable use of the Nile waters without causing significant harm to other countries, to its neighbors. So Ethiopia has repeatedly stated that it is governed by these principles. So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is being constructed and is going to be used based on these key principles. From the beginning, Ethiopia has repeatedly stated that it is building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam for equitable and reasonable use of the Nile resources, and observing its obligation not to cause significant harm to its neighbors. What does that mean? It is given when a country builds a dam on a certain river that there is going to be a reservoir behind that dam. There is going to be an artificial lake behind that dam. So until that dam is filled to its full capacity, there is going to be a little decrease in the flow of the water, the natural flow of the water. That is what it means by the obligation not to cause significant harm. It will reduce a little bit, but it should be done in a way that doesn't cause significant harm. Ethiopia has repeatedly stated that it will observe this obligation. And the other reason for Ethiopia, Ethiopia is within its right, is that it is entitled to use the resources of the Nile water. So that what Ethiopia is doing by building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is trying to use equitably the resources of the Nile. And when you have a dam like the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, it is for hydroelectric power generation purpose. And once the dam reaches its full capacity and starts generating power, the natural flow of the water will continue. So that is what it means by the no significant harm to neighbors. So these key international principles established by the UN are being observed on the part of Ethiopia. The other is there is a natural and a natural right for Ethiopia to use a kind of water resource that originates within its own territory. As a country that contributes 85% of the Nile waters, Ethiopia has the right to equitable usage of that resource. So in every sense, Ethiopia has the right to use these resources. Let us put these are great questions. Let us put them in three parts. The first part refers to Egypt and why it is acting in such a way recently that it is being harmed by Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam. Um, let's look at the background for that. Historically, Egypt has been the beneficiary of an unfair colonial era deals, the 1929 and the 1959 deals that essentially were sponsored by Britain. These deals were signed with Egypt. The first one was signed with Egypt. The second one was signed among Britain, Egypt, and Sudan. Let's look at the second one, which allows Egypt to get an annual flow of 55 billion cubic water from the Nile River uninterrupted, regardless of the needs of development and the needs for the use of the Nile water resources by other upstream countries. This is against international principles. For example, the Convention on Navigation Use of Water Courses, according to the UN, the Article 4 of that convention says, where it refers to parties to water course agreements. That means whenever there is a water course agreement, there is this obligation. Every watercourse state is entitled to participate in the negotiation of and to become a party to any watercourse agreement that applies to the entire international watercourse, as well as to participate in any relevant consultations. So this means there are about 11 countries along the Nile River Basin, all the way from Uganda, across Kenya, South Sudan, Tanzania, Rwanda, to downstream countries, Sudan and Egypt. There are about 11 countries, 11 Nile riparian countries. Then the colonial era treaties included only 2 of these riparian countries. So those treaties are not acceptable by any standard. But it is in Egypt's favor to try to uphold those agreements, to keep those agreements forever, because there are 2 elements of that agreement that are not acceptable to the rest of the riparian countries along the Nile Basin. One, it gives Egypt 55 billion cubic meter water flow uninterrupted annually. That implies the rest of the riparian countries should not do anything if Egypt doesn't allow that development or any kind of project along the Nile Basin. It is not appropriate for the 3 countries, Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, to take this issue, these negotiations to Washington. It is a very distant party to the matter. This issue should be resolved within the African Union framework. It is an African issue and it can be resolved by African institutions. So there are several existing institutions such as the Nile Basin Initiative and the African Union, which can address these issues. Include other sub-regional institutions or blocks are also there. IGAD, several of the riparians of the Nile River are members of the IGAD. So to be inclusive, the African Union would be an ideal party, and the Nile Basin Initiative would be a very special technical institution to help in that regard. So these countries include the rest of the riparian countries, the 11 countries along the Nile Basin, and continue the negotiation and come to an equitable and fair usage agreement to all parties within the framework of the African Union, addressing African issues within Africa. So it is right for the several experts to suggest that way. But let me go back to my previous point and connect the two. Why is Egypt trying to take this issue outside of the African Union or the African continent? For two reasons. Previously, I stated the colonial era deals that give Egypt unfair privilege and fair, veto over the use of the Nile waters. Egypt wants that those deals to remain. When the Nile Basin countries have signed a deal in 2010, the framework agreement, the framework cooperation agreement. When they signed that, it is cooperative framework agreement. They signed this agreement in 2010. When many of the Nile riparian countries were involved in the process, in the negotiation, and finally, when they signed this agreement, it means it automatically nullifies the colonial era agreements. Ever since, Egypt has been looking for excuse and opportunity to reverse that course. So with the recent deadlock in the Washington negotiations, Egypt is trying hard to capitalize on that and get back to the colonial era situation, where it will be the only beneficiary entitled for the Nile water resources. But that is going not to return. That's why Egypt is capitalizing on the diplomatic failure on the side of Washington regarding these negotiations. While Washington was there as an observer, it mistakenly played the role of a party to the negotiation, dictating terms, unfavorable terms, especially to Ethiopia. The other element is, you mentioned earlier, the Arab League, taking the issue to the Arab League, but the Arab League doesn't have much members from the Nile riparian countries. So it is a biased institution, but it is a toothless lion to add to that, and it has a serious legitimacy deficiency, moral legitimacy in that regard as well. It hasn't acted appropriately when many of its members were bombed by NATO and other forces around the world. So there is no need to worry about the Arab League, but that indicates Egypt is trying to take the issue out of the African continent, in the hope that that the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam negotiations would eventually fail, and it will go to international arbitration, and it's trying to garner support to win against the rest of the riparian countries. Now, coming back to the key issues, the countries should continue to negotiate. One issue I should raise here is, repeatedly many institutions, and Egyptian institutions mainly, characterize Sudan as a subordinate or an auxiliary to Egypt. Sudan is a sovereign country with its own interest on Nile issues. Sudan is negotiating for the protection of its own national interests when it comes to the issue of Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Sudan knows it benefits from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam in multiple ways. One, it gets cheaper access for electricity. Two, it is a very good remedy for Sudan to protect itself from being flooded every year when the main rainy season is on in Ethiopia. That said, what are the main factors that these countries need to observe when they negotiate for equitable and reasonable utilization of the water resources, as it is a shared resource? The two main factors I stated earlier are one, as I said, is equitable and reasonable use. The other is the obligation not to cause harm. What factors should they consider to make sure this is the case? There are geographic, hydrographic, hydrological, and climatic, ecological, and other factors of natural character that these countries should observe. This is stated in the international convention, by the way. There are also social and economic needs of the watercourse states concerned. The population dependent on the watercourse in each watercourse state. If we look at these only three factors, Ethiopia is entitled for the use of the Nile waters for the purpose stated in the construction with the intention to construct the Grand Renaissance Dam. So if these countries continue to negotiate within Africa, I'm sure they would reach to an amicable agreement that benefits all, considering all these factors. The two documents or agreements you mentioned are, one is the 2010 Cooperative Framework Agreement, which I explained earlier is a major breakthrough for the Nile Basin Initiative. This is probably the biggest single greatest achievement or success of the Nile Basin Initiative, which, as I said earlier, entails the official nullification of the colonial era treaties, which were clearly biased in favor of Egypt. This is a great success for the rest of the Nile riparian countries, mainly the upstream countries and Sudan. But for Egypt, this is a bad news because it is the end of the veto or the upper hand it has enjoyed for decades against the development interests of the rest of the Nile riparian countries. This is a signed agreement, but many of the countries along the Nile Basin have ratified this agreement with their parliaments. Some, obviously, Egypt hasn't ratified it yet. Some other countries, a couple of other countries have not ratified yet. But I think the number required for these to take effect is about 7 to 8. If 7 to 8 member countries have ratified this, it will be a governing agreement across all the Nile Basin from Uganda to Egypt. So I think this will materialize soon. The second document you mentioned is the Declaration of Principles, which was signed by Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. It was signed in 2015. There are 10 points on this agreement. And in summary, what I understood from these 10 points is that this document meant this was also signed by Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and this is a done deal. This is an agreed document. So what this document entails in short is cooperation, principle of development, regional integration, and sustainability, solving issues through negotiations, solving disagreements through negotiations, and goodwill to come to agreements for understanding among the three countries. And the other element is the principle of the dam storage reservoir first filling and dam operation policies. And below the fifth element, the principle of dams or storage reservoir first filling and the dam operation policies, it doesn't stipulate any specific guideline, for example, any number of years. It doesn't say 7 to 20 years, or Ethiopia should fill the dam in 7 to 20 years or so. For all intents, this principle number 5 is an interpretation and explanation of what is stated in the UN Convention, which implies the equitable and fair usage of resources without causing harm to any neighbors. So why the disagreement has come this time is because Egypt is demanding something that implies it doesn't have a goodwill. It doesn't have a goodwill to come to terms. It doesn't have a goodwill for cooperation and for consensus to come to an agreement through the principle of give and take. The main problem with the Washington negotiations, in my view, I don't say the negotiations on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam have failed. It is interrupted. I would say it is interrupted, or it is halted temporarily because Egypt has put forward an acceptable demand for Ethiopia mainly. So Ethiopia stated that it's not going to sign this agreement at this point, and it needs time to review and discuss within its constituencies. Sudan also didn't sign this agreement, so it indicates it's only Egypt which is pushing for this agreement, and this because it is in its interest. So on the side of the Washington, I don't think they realized the kind of mistake they have made by pushing for this one-sided, biased agreement. So the reason this round of the negotiations in Washington came to a deadlock is because Egypt is trying to impose through Washington unacceptable terms of demanding Ethiopia to fill the dam in a very extended, unreasonably extended number of years, as much as 21 years, I guess. And that is unacceptable for Ethiopia. And when it comes to the operations of the dam, Egypt has also put unacceptable demands that is essentially asking for Ethiopia to hand over the dam to Egypt. It is not acceptable. It's a sovereignty issue, and it's not acceptable. The other element of this, the Washington negotiations, the key issue was when it comes to elements that relate to prolonged drought periods or extended dry the seasons. This element for me is very funny because Egypt expects Ethiopia to ensure a flow of a certain amount of water, about 39 billion cubic water, 39 billion cubic water annually after the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, even though the natural amount of the natural flow of the Nile River is reduced below that. When there is an extended dry season or extended period of drought, which entails a reduction in the natural flow of the Nile waters, that flows into the dam, that automatically comes out of the dam after generating power. For example, if the flow or the natural flow of water is 20 billion cubic meter annually in a certain dry season, Egypt expects Ethiopia to release 19 billion cubic meter water from the dam, in addition to the natural 20 billion cubic meter water flow, to ensure that its quota is observed. So this is unacceptable, and for me, it's a funny demand. So such kind of demands from the Egyptian side, which were pushed forward unwittingly perhaps by Washington, have led to the deadlock. And the only way for this deadlock to be resolved and for the countries to move forward and to reach an agreement is for Egypt to come to a realization that it is a different era, that times have changed, and there is the only way out is cooperation, mutual benefit, integration, and the principle of respecting others' interests. There are two elements to this question. The first element is a matter of strategy and long-term focus. On the side of the Ethiopian government, there is a need to develop a strategy, especially a communications strategy that governs the engagement, the media engagement, and the approach when it comes to the issue of Nile and the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is one project. It will be completed sooner or later. Once that is completed, the Nile issue would continue. As long as we are there, the Nile is there. So it would continue. So Ethiopian government needs to come up with a strategy, a communication strategy that is tailored to address these issues, not only to local audiences, but to international audiences, mainly in the Middle East and particularly in Egypt and Sudan. Let's not forget Sudan as well. Sudan has been standing with Ethiopia, of course, in protection of its own interest, has been having a fair stand so far. There could be concerns on the side of the Sudanese population or misconception, because Sudanese people speak Arabic, and the Egyptian media are broadcast mainly in Arabic, and their broadcast reach Sudanese population, and they may mislead. There could be a misconception. So on the side of Ethiopia, there is a need to counter that, not only in Sudan, but also in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, in Middle Eastern countries. So once the Ethiopian government has developed that communication strategy, the Ethiopian media mainly need to follow and do their part in addressing this issue. And in their current form, the Ethiopian media, in my view, have some fundamental production quality and content issues. This makes their content less attractive to international or foreign audiences, which including the Middle Eastern audiences. And when we look at it from a perspective of the current proliferation of satellite media across the world, people have multitudes of options, much better quality content compared to what is broadcast and available online from the Ethiopian media side. Therefore, what Ethiopian media need to do is endeavor more and more on addressing these production quality issues in order to successfully and effectively reach as many foreign audiences, mainly around Africa and the Middle East, as I said. This means producing more and more contents tailored for the foreign audiences, some of whom are present in Addis Ababa as part of the International Diplomatic Corps, for example. Addis Ababa has one of the largest diplomatic presence around the world. It competes with New York, Washington, and Geneva in the number of diplomatic corps that reside in Addis Ababa, because it is the seat of the African Union and the African Economic Commission and several other continental and international organizations. So that creates an ideal condition. What I have observed so far with Ethiopian media is whenever there is AU summit in Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian media produce some content and broadcast some content that has a flavor and a touch of African, flavor, so to say, with music and some interviews and some documentaries about the history of the African Union. Ethiopian media need to go beyond that. Ethiopian media need to produce some quality production in English, Arabic, and French, and capitalize on the presence of this diplomatic community, their families, and people that flock to the city because of this international element. So in order to grab their attention, in order to successfully have this audience follow Ethiopian media, there is a need to have a competitive quality in terms of the kind of content produced and competitive quality in the kind of production quality. One element, for example, one issue, for example, I suggest Ethiopian media can do is produce and broadcast several series of documentaries about life along the Nile River. It can start from, let's say, Uganda or our neighbor Kenya and go across the Blue Nile in Ethiopia. Show the lives of Ethiopians along the Nile River, how poverty-stricken people are along the Nile River, while that rich water resource flows for centuries. And go on and show the life along the Nile River in Sudan. Address the concerns and the issues of Sudanese along the Nile River. They are always affected by flooding, almost every year. So Ethiopian media need to go out of their comfort zone, and they have done a pretty good job when it comes to local audience. That should continue. The Ethiopian media should continue to reinforce, patriotism and national unity around Nile and related issues, but they need to go out of that comfort zone and exploit the regional and continental element of the Nile issue and present quality content to international audience.